Hello, class. This week's lecture and chapter are on ethics and privacy. And ethics has always been an issue with business because the point of business is to make money, to achieve monopoly if you can, which is the best way to make money. And often to do that, your methods are somewhat questionable sometimes. So the greatest example of that are the tobacco companies, and the 40s and 50s and 60s companies like R.J. Reynolds were purposely misleading people into thinking that smoking was good for you, when in fact they had their own studies conducted in-house that proved that it was very damaging to a person's health, and eventually they had to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in reparations, if you will, to make up for that cover-up. So when we talk about ethics today, we look at what is appropriate for a company to do to achieve its strategic goals, what should it do, and there is a difference between what is moral and what is illegal. So for example, it might not be, and this is an example from your text, it might not be illegal for a bank to foreclose on a house, but it might be immoral because that person is a veteran who was wounded in Afghanistan serving the country, and they were making payments and they just happened to miss one or two, and it was at the time there was a balloon payment on the mortgage, and so the bank really didn't need to foreclose on it, but they did anyway. Not illegal, but most people would consider that to be immoral. So companies are often left with these decisions that it's really not a black or white issue, it's a gray area, because when you're trying to make money off of people buying things, often in some way, even a small way, you're taking advantage of them. And so that might be convincing them to buy your cell phone over a competitor's, even though you know the competitor's phone is cheaper and takes better pictures. So that's something that all business people struggle with. Some companies are highly moral, at least they consider themselves to be highly moral and ethical, like Tom's Shoes. They donate shoes to third world individuals who can't afford them. So every pair you buy, they donate some to someone else. So they consider what they're doing to be highly ethical. And there are other companies that just sort of bide their time until the influence of their lobbyists will change the laws to make what they're doing legal. So a very powerful lobby is that of the energy companies, ExxonMobil, who makes world history record profits, and they have hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, to throw at changing lawmakers' minds about what is legal and what is illegal. So there's a big debate right now about fracking, which is a specific process where they pressurize areas underground that contain shale oil. And what ends up happening, at least what they think is happening now, is it causes tons of micro earthquakes. It can contaminate the underground aquifers, damaging the water supply to areas. And so there's a big battle with whether we should make that illegal or not from an environmental perspective. But of course, the oil companies throw a lot of money at the politicians, who are the ones that are supposed to make those laws to change that. So there's a constant back and forth, and it's important to remember that most corporations, or at least the corporation as an entity, a company as an entity, is neither moral or immoral. It's really amoral, meaning it's beyond morals. It's also eternal, meaning unless something specific happens to stop it, it keeps on going. And that's part of the challenge as the country has changed our laws so that corporations can be considered to be individuals. The problem is they're individuals that don't die. So they can wait a long time, and they can put a lot of influence or bring a lot of influence to bear on individuals when you have long ceased to be able to fight them. So there's some really tough situations that are going to be coming up in the near future. Now there are some groups that attempt to fight this or mollify this influence. Some of the groups are consumer advocacy groups. Ralph Nader, who ran for president a couple times, is one of the most famous individuals in the country in regards to consumer advocacy, protecting the rights of the consumer. And a lot of times they say, you know what, the company can still make money and not serve us food with poison in it, or not give us paint with lead in it. And that's what those groups do. There's also groups of business people. For example, I was very involved in Rotary for quite a while as president of my local club. And Rotary was really started for business people, by business people. Now, of course, you can be from a nonprofit or a government entity and be a part of a club. But you're supposed to act based on the four-way test, which is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned? So it's looking at these business transactions and saying, you don't have to rip somebody off to make money. In fact, it's better for you personally and for society in general in the long run if you find out ways to make deals work for the both of you. And if something really is truly not right in your heart, it's not right, then don't do it. So there's is a balance to this. It's not just these faceless, nameless corporations running around doing bad. And most of the people working at these large corporations, by the way, also are not necessarily evil people. They just end up getting in positions where you're trying to make your sales figure for the last quarter of the year, and you really need that bonus because your daughter's going off to college, and you've got a big payment coming up, and you see the situation where you can exploit an error in a contract. Your business partner missed it, and they're going to end up paying for it, but you take advantage of it anyway. And that's the kind of stuff that happens. People find ways to justify their actions to themselves, just like if you read the testimony and the comments of the individuals involved in the big Enron scandal. They found ways to explain why they were taking such illegal and immoral actions. If you look at the individuals involved in the financial crash in 07 and 08, people from Goldman Sachs and ING and those kinds of places, they find ways to explain how, they really were acting in the best interest of their customers. It just happened to end up, costing the taxpayers billions of dollars, and it really wasn't their mistake. That's kind of what happens. People justify things. So we're posed with a couple of questions when we're talking about these issues ethically, and also now because technology is so prevalent in our society and ubiquitous, we have to ask, what about privacy? In the past, people were very guarded about what you knew about them, at least outside of the small communities that they lived in. They didn't want people across the country knowing everything about them. Now you basically give companies carte blanche to look at everything you're doing. When you're using your cell phone, those companies are tracking where you are at all times, how much data you're accessing, what you're accessing. If you're on a social media site like Snapchat or Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, any of those, they're tracking what you're doing, who you're connecting to, and often the user agreements actually prompt you to give away your rights to those images and text that you're posting inside those outlets, and they can do whatever they want with them, basically. So there comes a point where you have to question what should be private. Do you want your Social Security number and all of your credit information, every bill you've ever paid late, do you want that shared with multiple companies? Because when you do business with a chain like a Walmart or a Target, not only are they collecting huge amounts of information on you, but then they often turn around and sell that block of data to a collection company, and I call them shadow companies often. One of the biggest shadow companies is Axion, and they have 1,500 data points on 96% of the households in the United States. So what ends up happening is that it costs you money eventually. For example, if you happen to fit into one of these categories where they think that you're a credit risk, in other words, you might be late in a credit card payment or you might be late on a car payment, they end up charging you a higher interest rate. So even if you wouldn't have actually been late, you end up paying more for what you're buying as if you would be late. And so some people feel that that type of categorization is a form of discrimination. So that's a big issue. And there's the further issue of just electronic surveillance in general. As I mentioned, these cell phone companies know where you are all the time. Google knows where you are and what you're accessing. The federal government and some state and local governments are watching you on camera all the time. If you're on campus and most of the spots you're in, you're being watched on camera and recorded. So at what point does the need for safety and security overcome the right for some privacy? And so that's going to come more into play as people install these home security systems where you've got a camera in every room and you can be at work and look on your cell phone and see what's happening at your house, what room the kids are playing on and so forth. But where else is that data going? And often these companies are not very particular about how they protect your data. So a couple years ago, Target had their point of sale system, meaning where you check out at the cash register. That system was hacked and a bunch of information went over to Eastern Europe, and they really weren't held that accountable for what happened there. So that's a big issue, and how people view privacy and how the governments view privacy differ from country to country, and that's a big deal because we're in such a global marketplace. So the European Union is fiercely protective of privacy and allowing people to choose how their information is used and shared. So Google has to operate very differently in the EU and more carefully than they do here. People have to be able to opt out much more easily than they are on this side of the Atlantic. Now, if we also take Google and look at China, China's totally different. The country of China, the government, wants to control everything. They want to see what people are doing. They want access to Gmail and so forth. And so that's why eventually Google pulled out, at least temporarily, in 2010 out of China. They did not want to give the government access to all that information. So there's some pretty serious issues that are covered in this chapter. It's a brief chapter, but an important one. And I invite you to discuss these issues with each other. Feel free to stop by and we can talk further about these issues as well, because they're issues that are going to affect you throughout your life, and increasingly so because of the use of technology. Take care.